Section 3 of All About Coffee. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. All About Coffee by William Ukers. Chapter 3, Part 1. Early History of Coffee Drinking. Coffee in the Near East in the Early Centuries. Stories of its origin. Discovery by physicians and adoption by the Church. It spread through Arabia, Persia, and Turkey. Persecutions and intolerances. Early coffee manners and customs. The coffee drink had its rise in the classical period of Arabian medicine, which dates from Raziz, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria el-Razi, who followed the doctrines of Galen and sat at the feet of Hippocrates. Raziz, 850 through 922, was the first to treat medicine in an encyclopedic manner and, according to some authorities, the first writer to mention coffee. He assumed the poetical name of Razi because he was a native of the city of Raj in Persian Iraq. He was a great philosopher and astronomer, and at one time was superintendent of the hospital at Baghdad. He wrote many learned books on medicine and surgery, but his principal work is Al-Haywi, or The Continent, a collection of everything relating to the cure of disease from Galen to his own time. Philippe Sylvestre Dufour, 1622 through 1687, a French coffee merchant, philosopher, and writer, in an accurate and finished treatise on coffee tells us, see the early edition of the work translated from the Latin, that the first writer to mention the properties of the coffee bean under the name of bunchum was this same Raziz, in the 9th century after the birth of our Savior, from which, if true, it would appear that coffee has been known for upwards of 1,000 years. Robinson, however, is of the opinion that bunchum meant something else and had nothing to do with coffee. Dufour himself, in a later edition of his Traité nouveau et curieux du café, The Hague, 1693, is inclined to admit that bunchum may have been a root and not coffee after all. However, he is careful to add that there is no doubt that the Arabs knew coffee as far back as the year 800. Other, more modern authorities place it as early as the 6th century. Wiji Kawi is mentioned in a Kavi, Javan, inscription AD 856, and it is thought that the bean broth in David Taperi's list of Javanese beverages, 1667 through 1682, may have been coffee. While the true origin of coffee drinking may be forever hidden among the mysteries of the Purple East, shrouded as it is in legend and fable, scholars have marshaled sufficient facts to prove that the beverage was known in Ethiopia from time immemorial, and there is much to add for similitude to Dufour's narrative. The first coffee merchant prince, skilled in languages and polite learning, considered that his character as a merchant was not inconsistent with that of an author, and he even went so far as to say there were some things, for instance coffee, on which a merchant could be better informed than a philosopher. Granting that by bunchum Raziz meant coffee, the plant and the drink must have been known to his immediate followers, and this indeed seems to be indicated by similar references in the writings of Avicenna, Ibn Sina, the Mohammedan physician and philosopher, who lived from 980 to 1037 AD. Raziz, in the quaint language of Dufour, assures us that bunchum, coffee, is hot and dry and very good for the stomach. Avicenna explains the medicinal properties and uses of the coffee bean, bon or bun, which he also calls bunchum after this fashion. As to the choice thereof, that of a lemon color, light, and of a good smell is the best. The white and the heavy is not. It is hot and dry in the first degree, and according to others, cold in the first degree. It fortifies the members, it cleans the skin, and dries up the humidities that are under it, and gives an excellent smell to all the body. The early Arabians called the bean and the tree that bore it bun, the drink bunchum. A. Galland 1646 through 1715, the French Orientalist who first analyzed and translated from the Arabic the Abd al-Qadir manuscript, the oldest document extant telling of the origin of coffee, observes that Avicenna speaks of the bun or coffee, as do also Prospero Alpini and Veslingius, Vesling. Ben Giasla, another great physician, contemporary with Avicenna, likewise mentions coffee, by which, says Galland, one may see that we are indebted to physicians for the discovery of coffee, as well as of sugar, tea, and chocolate. Raoul Wolff, died 1596, German physician and botanist, and the first European to mention coffee, who became acquainted with the beverage in Aleppo in 1573, telling how the drink was prepared by the Turks, says, "In this same water they take a fruit called banu, which in its bigness, shape, and color is almost like unto a bayberry, with two thin shells surrounded, which, as they informed me, are brought from the Indies. But as these in themselves are, and have within them two yellowish grains in two distinct cells, and besides, being they agree in their virtue, figure, looks, and name with the bunchum of Avicenna and bunco of Racis ad Almans exactly. Therefore, I take them to be the same." In Dr. Edward Pocock's translation, Oxford 1659, of "The nature of the drink cowhee or coffee, and the berry of which it is made, described by an Arabian physician," we read, "Bun is a plant in Yemen, which is planted in Adar, and groweth up and is gathered in Ab. It is about a cubit high, on a stalk about the thickness of one's thumb. It flowers white, leaving a berry like a small nut, but that sometimes it is broad like a bean, and when it is peeled, parteth in two. The best of it is that which is weighty and yellow, the worst that which is black. It is hot in the first degree, dry in the second. It is usually reported to be cold and dry, but it is not so, for it is bitter, and whatsoever is bitter is hot. It may be that the scorce is hot and the bun itself either of equal temperature or cold in the first degree. That which makes for its coldness is its stypticness. In summer, it is by experience found to conduce to the drying of rheums, and phlegmatic coughs and distillations, and the opening of obstructions, and the provocation of urine. It is now known by the name of kowa. When it is dried and thoroughly boiled, it allays the ebullition of the blood, is good against the smallpox and measles, the bloody pimples, yet causeth vertiginous headache, and maketh lean much, occasioneth waking, and the emerods, and assuageous lust, and sometimes breeds melancholy. He that would drink it for liveliness' sake, and to discuss slothfulness, and the other properties that we have mentioned, let him use much sweet meats with it, and oil of pistachios, and butter. Some drink it with milk, but it is an error, and such as may bring in danger of the leprosy. Dufour concludes that the coffee beans of commerce are the same as the bunchum, bun, described by Avicenna, and the bunca, bunchum, of Raziz. In this he agrees, almost word for word, with Raoul Wolff, indicating no change in opinion among the learned in 100 years. Christopher Campen thinks Hippocrates, father of medicine, knew and administered coffee. Robinson, commenting upon the early adoption of coffee into materia medica, charges that it was a mistake on the part of the Arab physicians and that it originated the prejudice that caused coffee to be regarded as a powerful drug instead of as a simple and refreshing beverage. Homer, the Bible, and coffee. In early Grecian and Roman writings, no mention is made of either the coffee plant or the beverage made from the berries. Pietro Delia Vale, 1586 through 1652, however, maintains that the nepenthe, which Homer says Helen brought with her out of Egypt, and which she employed as surcease for sorrow, was nothing else but coffee mixed with wine. This is disputed by Monsieur Petit, a well-known physician of Paris, who died in 1687. Several later British authors, among them Sandys the poet, Burton, and Sir Henry Blount have suggested the probability of coffee being the black broth of the Lacedaemonians. George Pascius, in his Latin treatise of the New Discoveries Made Since the Time of the Ancients, printed at Leipzig in 1700, says he believes that coffee was meant by the 5 measures of parched corn included among the presents Abigail made to David to appease his wrath, as recorded in the Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 18. The Vulgate translates the Hebrew words sain kali into sata polenta, which signify wheat roasted or dried by fire. Pierre-Étienne Louis Dumont, the Swiss Protestant minister and author, is of the opinion that coffee, and not lentils as others have supposed, was the red pottage for which Esau sold his birthright. Also that the parched grain that Boaz ordered to be given Ruth was undoubtedly roasted coffee berries. Dufour mentions as a possible objection against coffee that the use and eating of beans were heretofore forbidden by Pythagoras, but intimates that the coffee bean of Arabia is something different. Scheuser, in his Physique Sacrée, says, "The Turks and the Arabs make with the coffee bean a beverage which bears the same name, and many persons use as a substitute the flour of roasted barley." From this we learned that the coffee substitute is almost as old as coffee itself. Some early legends. After medicine, the church. There are several Mohammedan traditions that have persisted through the centuries, claiming for the faithful the honor and glory of the first use of coffee as a beverage. One of these relates how, about 1258 A.D., Sheikh Omar, a disciple of Sheikh Abul Hassan Shadeli, patron saint and legendary founder of Mocha, by chance discovered the coffee drink at Usab in Arabia, whither he had been exiled for a certain moral remissness. Facing starvation, he and his followers were forced to feed upon the berries growing around them, and then, in the words of the faithful Arab chronicle in the Bibliothèque Nationale at Paris, having nothing to eat except coffee, they took of it and boiled it in a saucepan, and drank of the decoction. Former patients in Mocha, who sought out the good doctor-priest in his Usab retreat for physic with which to cure their ills, were given some of this decoction, with beneficial effect. As a result of the stories of its magical properties, carried back to the city, Sheikh Omar was invited to return in triumph to Mocha, where the governor caused to be built a monastery for him and his companions. Another version of this Oriental legend gives it as follows. The dervish Haji Omar was driven by his enemies out of Mocha into the desert, where they expected he would die of starvation. This undoubtedly would have occurred if he had not plucked up courage to taste some strange berries which he found growing on a shrub. While they seemed to be edible, they were very bitter, and he tried to improve the taste by roasting them. He found, however, that they had become very hard, so he attempted to soften them with water. The berries seemed to remain as hard as before, but the liquid turned brown, and Omar drank it on the chance that it contained some of the nourishment from the berries. He was amazed at how it refreshed him, enlivened his sluggishness, and raised his drooping spirits. Later, when he returned to Mocha, his salvation was considered a miracle. The beverage to which it was due sprang into high favor, and Omar himself was made a saint. A popular and much-quoted version of Omar's discovery of coffee, also based upon the Abd al-Qadir manuscript, is the following. In the year of the Hegira 656, the Mullah Shadeli went on a pilgrimage to Mecca. Arriving at the Mountain of the Emeralds, Usab, he turned to his disciple Omar and said, "I shall die in this place. When my soul has gone forth, a veiled person will appear to you. Do not fail to execute the command which he will give you." The venerable Shadeli being dead, Omar saw in the middle of the night a gigantic specter covered by a white veil. "Who are you?" he asked. The phantom drew back his veil, and Omar saw with surprise Shadeli himself, grown 10 cubits since his death. The mullah dug in the ground, and water miraculously appeared. The spirit of his teacher bade Omar fill a bowl with the water and to proceed on his way and not to stop till he reached the spot where the water would stop moving. "It is there," he added, "that a great destiny awaits you." Omar started his journey. Arriving at Mocha in Yemen, he noticed that the water was immovable. It was here that he must stop. The beautiful village of Mocha was then ravaged by the plague. Omar began to pray for the sick, and, as the saintly man was close to Muhammad, many found themselves cured by his prayers. The plague, meanwhile progressing, the daughter of the king of Mocha fell ill, and her father had her carried to the home of the dervish who cured her. But as the young princess was of rare beauty, after having cured her, the good dervish tried to carry her off. The king did not fancy this new kind of reward. Omar was driven from the city and exiled on the mountain of Usab, with herbs for food and a cave for a home. "Oh, Shadelhi, my dear master," cried the unfortunate dervish one day, "if the things which happened to me at Mocha were destined, was it worth the trouble to give me a bowl to come here?" To these just complaints there was heard immediately a song of incomparable harmony, and a bird of marvelous plumage came to rest in a tree. Omar sprang forward quickly toward the little bird which sang so well, but then he saw on the branches of the tree only flowers and fruit. Omar laid hands on the fruit and found it delicious. Then he filled his great pockets with it and went back to his cave. As he was preparing to boil a few herbs for his dinner, the idea came to him of substituting for this sad soup some of his harvested fruit. From it he obtained a savory and perfumed drink. It was coffee. The Italian Journal of the Savants, for the year 1760, says that two monks, Scialdi and Aeduus, were the first to discover the properties of coffee, and for this reason became the object of special prayers. Was not this Scialdi identical with the Sheikh Shadeli? Asked Jardin. The most popular legend ascribes the discovery of the drink to an Arabian herdsman in Upper Egypt or Abyssinia, who complained to the abbot of a neighboring monastery that the goats confided to his care became unusually frolicsome after eating the berries of certain shrubs found near their feeding grounds. The abbot, having observed the fact, determined to try the virtues of the berries on himself. He, too, responded with a new exhilaration. Accordingly, he directed that some be boiled and the decoction drunk by his monks, who thereafter found no difficulty in keeping awake during the religious services of the night. The Abbé Massieu, in his poem Carmen Cafeum, thus celebrates the event. The monks each in turn, as the evening draws near, drink round the great cauldron a circle of cheer, and the dawn in amaze, revisiting that shore, on idle beds of ease, surprised them nevermore. According to the legend, the news of the wakeful monastery spread rapidly, and the magical berry soon came to be in request throughout the whole kingdom, and in progress of time other nations and provinces of the East fell into the use of it. The French have preserved the following picturesque version of this legend. A young goatherd named Caldi noticed one day that his goats, whose deportment up to that time had been irreproachable, were abandoning themselves to the most extravagant prancings. The venerable buck, ordinarily so dignified and solemn, bounded about like a young kid. Caldi attributed this foolish gaiety to certain fruits of which the goats had been eating with delight. The story goes that the poor fellow had a heavy heart, and in the hope of cheering himself up a little, he thought he would pick and eat of the fruit. The experiment succeeded marvelously. He forgot his troubles and became the happiest herder in happy Arabia. When the goats danced, he gaily made himself one of the party and entered into their fun with admirable spirit. One day, a monk chanced to pass by and stopped in surprise to find a ball going on. A score of goats were executing lively pirouettes like a lady's chain, while the buck solemnly balanced, and the herder went through the figures of an eccentric pastoral dance. The astonished monk inquired the cause of this saltatorial madness, and Caldi told him of his precious discovery. Now this poor monk had a great sorrow. He always went to sleep in the middle of his prayers, and he reasoned that Mohammed, without doubt, was revealing this marvelous fruit to him to overcome his sleepiness. Piety does not exclude gastronomic instincts. Those of our good monk were more than ordinary, because he thought of drying and boiling the fruit of the herder. This ingenious concoction gave us coffee. Immediately all the monks of the realm made use of the drink, because it encouraged them to pray and perhaps also because it was not disagreeable. In those early days, it appears that the drink was prepared in two ways, one in which the decoction was made from the hull and the pulp surrounding the bean, and the other from the bean itself. The roasting process came later, and is an improvement generally credited to the Persians. There is evidence that the early Mohammedan churchmen were seeking a substitute for the wine forbidden to them by the Koran when they discovered coffee. The word for coffee in Arabic, kahwa, is the same as one of those used for wine, and later on, when coffee drinking grew so popular as to threaten the very life of the church itself, this similarity was seized upon by the church leaders to support their contention that the prohibition against wine applied also to coffee. Larocque, writing in 1715, says that the Arabian word kahwa signified at first only wine, but later was turned into a generic term applied to all kinds of drink. So there were really three sorts of coffee, namely wine, including all intoxicating liquors, the drink made with the shells, or cods, of the coffee bean, and that made from the bean itself. Originally, then, the coffee drink may have been a kind of wine made from the coffee fruit. In the coffee countries, even today, the natives are very fond, and eat freely, of the ripe coffee cherries, voiding the seeds. The pulp surrounding the coffee seeds, beans, is pleasant to taste, has a sweetish aromatic flavor, and quickly ferments when allowed to stand. Still another tradition, was the wish father to the thought, tells how the coffee drink was revealed to Muhammad himself by the angel Gabriel. Coffee's partisans found satisfaction in a passage in the Quran which, they said, foretold its adoption by the followers of the Prophet. They shall be given to drink an excellent wine, sealed. Its seal is that of the musk. The most diligent research does not carry a knowledge of coffee back beyond the time of Raziz, 200 years after Muhammad, so there is little more than speculation or conjecture to support the theory that it was known to the ancients in Bible times or in the days of the Praised One. Our knowledge of tea, on the other hand, antedates the Christian era. We know also that tea was intensively cultivated and taxed under the Tang dynasty in China, AD 793, and that Arab traders knew of it in the following century. The first reliable coffee date. About 1454, Sheikh Gamaluddin Abu Muhammad bin Said, Mufti of Aden, surnamed al-Dabani, from Daban, a small town where he was born, became acquainted with the virtues of coffee on a journey into Abyssinia. Upon his return to Aden, his health became impaired, and remembering the coffee he had seen his countrymen drinking in Abyssinia, he sent for some in the hope of finding relief. He not only recovered from his illness, but because of its sleep-dispelling qualities, he sanctioned the use of the drink among the dervishes that they might spend the night in prayers or other religious exercises with more attention and presence of mind. It is altogether probable that the coffee drink was known in Aden before the time of Sheikh Gamaluddin, but the endorsement of the very learned Imam, whose science and religion had already made famous, was sufficient to start a vogue for the beverage that spread throughout Yemen, and thence to the far corners of the world. We read in the Arabian manuscript at the Bibliothèque Nationale that lawyers, students, as well as travelers who journeyed at night, artisans, and others who worked at night to escape the heat of the day, took to drinking coffee, and even left off another drink, then becoming popular, made from the leaves of a plant called khat or cat, Catha edulis. Sheikh Gamaluddin was assisted in his work of spreading the gospel of this, the first propaganda for coffee, by one Muhammad al-Hadrami, a physician of great reputation, born in Hadramaut, Arabia Felix. A recently unearthed and little-known version of coffee's origin shows how features of both the Omar tradition and the Gamaluddin story may be combined by a professional Occidental tale writer. Toward the middle of the 15th century, a poor Arab was traveling in Abyssinia. Finding himself weak and weary, he stopped near a grove. For fuel wherewith to cook his rice, he cut down a tree that happened to be covered with dried berries. His meal being cooked and eaten, the traveler discovered that these half-burnt berries were fragrant. He collected a number of them and, on crushing them with a stone, found that the aroma was increased to a great extent. While wondering at this, he accidentally let the substance fall into an earthen vessel that contained his scanty supply of water. A miracle! The almost putrid water was purified. He brought it to his lips. It was fresh and agreeable, and after a short rest the traveler so far recovered his strength and energy as to be able to resume his journey. The lucky Arab gathered as many berries as he could, and having arrived at Aden, informed the Mufti of his discovery. That worthy was an inveterate opium smoker, who had been suffering for years from the influence of the poisonous drug. He tried an infusion of the roasted berries, and was so delighted at the recovery of his former vigor that in gratitude to the tree he called it kahuha, which in Arabic signifies force. Galland, in his analysis of the Arabian manuscript already referred to, that has furnished us with the most trustworthy account of the origin of coffee, criticizes Antoine Faustus Néron, Maronite professor of Oriental languages at Rome, who was the author of the first printed treatise on coffee only, for accepting the legends relating to Omar and the Abyssinian goatherd. He says they are unworthy of belief as facts of history, although he is careful to add that there is some truth in the story of the discovery of coffee by the Abyssinian goats and the abbot who prescribed the use of the berries for his monks. The Eastern Christians, being willing to have the honor of the invention of coffee, for the abbot or prior of the convent and his companions are only the Mufti Gamaluddin and Muhammad al-Hadrami, and the monks are the dervishes. Amid all these details, Jourdain reaches the conclusion that it is to chance we must attribute the knowledge of the properties of coffee, and that the coffee tree was transported from its native land to Yemen, as far as Mecca, and possibly into Persia, before being carried into Egypt. Coffee being thus favorably introduced into Aden, it has continued there ever since, without interruption. By degrees, the cultivation of the plant and the use of the beverage passed into many neighboring places. Toward the close of the 15th century, 1470 through 1500, it reached Mecca and Medina, where it was introduced, as at Aden, by the dervishes, and for the same religious purpose. About 1510, it reached Grand Cairo in Egypt, where the dervishes from Yemen, living in a district by themselves, drank coffee on the nights they intended to spend in religious devotion. They kept it in a large red earthen vessel, each in turn receiving it respectfully from their superior in a small bowl, which he dipped into the jar, in the meantime chanting their prayers, the burden of which was always, "There is no God but one God, the true King, whose power is not to be disputed." After the dervishes, the bowl was passed to lay members of the congregation. In this way, coffee came to be so associated with the act of worship that they never performed a religious ceremony in public and never observed any solemn festival without taking coffee. Meanwhile, the inhabitants of Mecca became so fond of the beverage that, disregarding its religious associations, they made of it a secular drink to be sipped publicly in café khanis, the first coffee houses. Here the idle congregated to drink coffee, to play chess and other games, to discuss the news of the day, and to amuse themselves with singing, dancing, and music, contrary to the manners of the rigid Mohammedans, who were very properly scandalized by such performances. In Medina, and in Cairo too, coffee became as common a drink as in Mecca and Aden. The First Coffee Persecution. At length, the pious Mohammedans began to disapprove of the use of coffee among the people. For one thing, it made common one of the best psychology adjuncts of their religion. Also, the joy of life that it helped to liberate among those who frequented the coffee houses precipitated social, political, and religious arguments, and these frequently developed into disturbances. Dissensions arose even among the churchmen themselves. They divided into camps for and against coffee. The law of the prophet on the subject of wine was variously construed as applying to coffee. About this time, 1511, Khair Bey was governor of Mecca for the Sultan of Egypt. He appears to have been a strict disciplinarian, but lamentably ignorant of the actual conditions obtaining among his people. As he was leaving the mosque one evening after prayers, he was offended by seeing in a corner a company of coffee drinkers who were preparing to pass the night in prayer. His first thought was that they were drinking wine, and great was his astonishment when he learned what the liquor really was and how common was its use throughout the city. Further investigation convinced him that indulgence in this exhilarating drink must incline men and women to extravagances prohibited by law, and so he determined to suppress it. First, he drove the coffee drinkers out of the mosque. The next day, he called a council of officers of justice, lawyers, physicians, priests, and leading citizens, to whom he declared what he had seen the evening before at the mosque, and, being resolved to put a stop to the coffee house abuses, he sought their advice upon the subject. The chief count in the indictment was that in these places men and women met and played tambourines, violins, and other musical instruments. There were also people who played chess, mancala, and other similar games for money, and there were many other things done contrary to our sacred law. May God keep it from all corruption until the day when we shall all appear before Him. The lawyers agreed that the coffee houses needed reforming, but as to the drink itself, inquiry should be made as to whether it was in any way harmful to mind or body, for if not, it might not be sufficient to close the places that sold it. It was suggested that the opinion of the physicians be sought. Two brothers, Persian physicians named Hakimani and reputed the best in Mecca, were summoned, although we are told they knew more about logic than they did about physic. One of them came into the council fully prejudiced, as he had already written a book against coffee, and filled with concern for his profession, being fearful lest the common use of the new drink would make serious inroads on the practice of medicine. His brother joined with him in assuring the assembly that the plant, bun, from which coffee was made, was cold and dry, and so unwholesome. When another physician present reminded them that Ben Ghiasla, the ancient and respected contemporary of Avicenna, taught that it was hot and dry, they made arbitrary answer that Ben Ghiasla had in mind another plant of the same name, and that, anyhow, it was not material, for if the coffee drink disposed people to things forbidden by religion, the safest course for Mohammedans was to look upon it as unlawful. The friends of coffee were covered with confusion. Only the Mufti spoke out in the meeting in its favor. Others, carried away by prejudice or misguided zeal, affirmed that coffee clouded their senses. One man arose and said it intoxicated like wine, which made everyone laugh, since he could hardly have been a judge of this if he had not drunk wine, which is forbidden by the Mohammedan religion. Upon being asked whether he had ever drunk any, he was so imprudent as to admit that he had, thereby condemning himself out of his own mouth to the bastinado. The Mufti of Aden, being both an officer of the court and a divine, undertook with some heat a defense of coffee, but he was clearly in an unpopular minority. He was rewarded with the reproaches and affronts of the religious zealots. So the governor had his way, and coffee was solemnly condemned as thing forbidden by the law, and a presentment was drawn up, signed by a majority of those present, and dispatched post-haste by the governor to his royal master, the Sultan, at Cairo. At the same time, the governor published an edict forbidding the sale of coffee in public or private. The officers of justice caused all the coffee houses in Mecca to be shut and ordered all the coffee found there, or in the merchants' warehouses, to be burned. Naturally enough, being an unpopular edict, there were many evasions, and much coffee drinking took place behind closed doors. Some of the friends of coffee were outspoken in their opposition to the order, being convinced that the assembly had rendered a judgment not in accordance with the facts, and above all, contrary to the opinion of the mufti, who, in every Arab community, is looked up to as the interpreter or expounder of the law. One man, caught in the act of disobedience, besides being severely punished, was also led through the most public streets of the city seated on an ass. However, the triumph of the enemies of coffee was short-lived, for not only did the Sultan of Cairo disapprove the indiscreet zeal of the governor of Mecca and order the edict revoked, but he read him a severe lesson on the subject. How dared he condemn a thing approved at Cairo, the capital of his kingdom, where there were physicians whose opinions carried more weight than those of Mecca, and who had found nothing against the law in the use of coffee? The best things might be abused, added the Sultan, even the sacred waters of Zamzam, but this was no reason for an absolute prohibition. The fountain or well of Zamzam, according to the Mohammedan teaching, is the same which God caused to spring up in the desert to comfort Hagar and Ishmael when Abraham banished them. It is in the enclosure of the temple at Mecca, and the Mohammedans drink of it with much show of devotion, ascribing great virtues to it. It is not recorded whether this misguided governor was shocked at this seeming profanity, but it is known that he hastened to obey the orders of his lord and master. The prohibition was recalled, and thereafter he employed his authority only to preserve order in the coffee houses. The friends of coffee and the lovers of poetic justice found satisfaction in the governor's subsequent fate. He was exposed as an extortioner and a public robber, and tortured to death, his brother killing himself to avoid the same fate. The two Persian physicians who had played so mean a part in the first coffee persecution likewise came to an unhappy end. Being discredited in Mecca, they fled to Cairo, where, in an unguarded moment, having cursed the person of Salim I, Emperor of the Turks, who had conquered Egypt, they were executed by his order. Coffee, being thus re-established at Mecca, met with no opposition until 1524, when, because of renewed disorders, the Cadi of the town closed the coffee houses, but did not seek to interfere with coffee drinking at home and in private. His successor, however, relicensed them, and continuing on their good behavior since then, they have not been disturbed. In 1542, a ripple was caused by an order issued by Suleiman the Great, forbidding the use of coffee, but no one took it seriously, especially as it soon became known that the order had been obtained by surprise and at the desire of only one of the court ladies, a little too nice in this point. One of the most interesting facts in the history of the coffee drink is that whenever it has been introduced, it has spelled revolution. It has been the world's most radical drink in that its function has always been to make people think. And when the people began to think, they became dangerous to tyrants and to foes of liberty, of thought and action. Sometimes the people became intoxicated with their newfound ideas, and, mistaking liberty for license, they ran amok and called down upon their heads persecutions and many petty intolerances. So history repeated itself in Cairo 23 years after the first Mecca persecution. End of section 3.